In many ways, the movie musical is the antithesis to horror in style, tone, and reputation.
Heaven, I'm in heaven.
There's something that feels so pure, so optimistic and wholesome about musicals. And unlike horror, musicals have always been a hugely respected and critically lauded genre. From the MGM Technicolor musicals of the 30s
Singing in the rain,
to the Gene Kelly pictures of the 40s and 50s, to the run of epic Best Picture winning musicals through the 1960s. But in the early 1970s, a young queer stage actor and musician called Richard O'Brien was working on his own musical.
Michael Rennie was ill the day the earth stood still.
By blending tropes from 50s sci-fi horror with classic musical numbers and a bit of 70s glam rock, Richard O'Brien came up with a unique formula for the ultimate cult movie.
I'm just a sweet transvestite.
Like the best horror movies, this was bold, shocking, subversive, and it appealed to the weirdos and the outsiders, the midnight movie audiences. But it was also a fantastic musical filled with feel-good, catchy tunes. This unique combination resulted in one of the most successful cult movies ever made, a movie still playing in cinemas right now after 46 years and holds the record for the longest running theatrical release in history. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of alien horror and we discuss Richard O'Brien's cult classic, The Rocky Horror Picture Show.
I see you shiver with anticipation.
Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 7th series exploring the history of alien, sci-fi, and cosmic horror, and so naturally, this week in part 9, we're going to be discussing the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I mean, it fits the bill, right? Sure. So I'm really excited for this week's discussion. We've got 2 excellent guests here to discuss the movie. Later on in this episode, you'll hear me chat with none other than musician, historian, BBC presenter Neil Brand to tell us a little bit about the music of the film and a little bit about the impact of Rocky Horror from a musical perspective. But first, let's talk a little bit about the movie. So I sat down with a very long-time friend of the pod. He was one of my very first guests and one of my most frequent and favourite contributors. He's the programmer for the BFI Cult Strand, as well as the UK's biggest queer movie festival, BFI Flair. I mean, really, he's the perfect person to talk about this movie. I sat down with none other than Michael Blyth to discuss what it is that makes the Rocky Horror Picture Show such an enduring classic. Hello and welcome back, Michael Blyth.
Hello, it's great to be here again.
So lovely to see you. How's everything? How's life?
Oh, you know, it's fine. We were just saying coronavirus is over now, so we're out to live our lives, be free.
I know, right? Everything's back to normal. So let me ask you about alien films, sci-fi, horror, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts on this subgenre?
I am a fan.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I mean, I guess there's that thing, isn't there, with kind of like alien science, sci-fi, horror stuff that, you know, it's the endless question of, is this science fiction or is this horror?
Yeah.
So I think that's the kind of constant thing, like, you know, is Alien a horror movie, is it a science fiction film?
I know.
And, you know, it's both. It can be these things. I think there's something about, maybe there's something to do with the idea of like science being part of the name of science fiction that people think, again, it's that kind of classier thing. You know, it's a bit like real, you know, there's like real ideas and thought going on here. Yeah, exactly. So maybe people want to claim Alien as a science fiction film because they feel it maybe elevates it somehow.
Yes.
But, you know, it's a pure horror movie. It's just set in space.
It is. And the two genres do seem to work well together, don't they? I mean, you see them lumped together often. I remember going to old video shops when I was growing up and there'd often be sci-fi and horror in the same section, you know, and that kind of thing. Do you think that they kind of get lumped into one category a lot of the time?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it helps because of the nerds, so they don't have to walk walk too far, do they? They can just kind of turn their head at the next thing. I mean, I guess it's the classic thing about the unknown, isn't it? You know, this kind of expansive unknown, and you know, there's nothing more than that than space. And so I think, yeah, they're definitely kind of good, you know, perfect kind of bedfellows. But I think, you know, there's a handful of classics and some kind of underrated stuff. But you know, Event Horizon for me is the kind of that great sci-fi horror movie. I love it so much.
Such a good balance of the two, isn't it? Yeah. And you know, there have been things that I've seen that you programmed at LFF, things like the Benson and Moorhead films, and I think they tick all those boxes as well, don't
absolutely.
they? Very smart, very thought-provoking, often quite creepy as well. You know?
And kind of often like bringing in that kind of like cosmic horror as well. So again, that different kind of science fiction, that Lovecraftian angle, which is super interesting too.
We've been doing, and you know, there's the more sci-fi end of sci-fi horror, I suppose, like Doctor Who, for example, and that kind of thing. Are you just a big sort of sci-fi fan generally, would you say, or do you tend to sort of...
Kind of here and there. I mean, I'm definitely more kind of drawn to the horror end of sci-fi. You know, when I was a kid, I was a huge obsessive X-Files fan. Like, my bedroom was covered in X-Files stuff. I was obsessed with it. But you know, I always preferred the Monster of the Week.
Yes.
To that overall kind of story arc of the conspiracy and the aliens and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think everyone did, even your hardcore sci-fi nerds were more into the Monster of the Week stuff, because I think X-Files got so convoluted by the end it was almost impossible to understand what was going on. But I mean, that show was hugely important to me, still is. But yeah, generally drawn to the more kind of horror end of science fiction.
The darkest. I need to get your advice then on what episodes I should watch, because I am a complete X-Files virgin.
I've got you.
There are too many, Michael. I can't binge the whole series before recording an episode about it. So I need like a good list of about 20 to 30 Monster of the Week episodes.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just give you a full list of my top to bottom. I thought the 240 episodes of X-Files.
The full rank
with notes on each. So yeah,
that is exactly what I want. Perfect. Now this is a different kind of question, and I haven't asked you about this before, but musicals. We're talking about specifically a horror musical, really for the first time on this podcast. And let me ask you briefly about musicals as well. Again, is this a genre that you sort of gravitate towards, or do you avoid?
Yeah, I love musicals.
Okay,
so I'm not here just for the horror angle. I'm here for the musical side too.
Amazing,
big
amazing.
Fan.
And again, is there a connection, do you think, in any way between horror and musical? Do you think that these are two genres that complement each other in any way?
I mean, I think they do. I guess there's something I never really thought about it before, but I mean, I guess there's something about excess and extravagance and, you know, this kind of outpouring of emotion, I guess, that kind of fits both of them to a certain extent. I mean, I think there haven't been, like, when you think of horror musicals, I think the ones that you think of aren't really horror films to a certain extent. They're films that are like homages to horror films, or indebted to horror films, or kind of reference horror films. Or so Rocky Horror Picture Show is a great example. So it's not a straight horror movie.
No, not
you know,
at all.
it's just a film that's infused with ideas about horror and infused with the kind of love of horror. Same with Little Shop of Horrors, Phantom of the Paradise. You know, these are films that they're not frightening. You don't watch them to be scared for a horror experience. But you watch them, you know, if you love horror, it just adds that element to them. It adds that kind of enjoyment and that kind of extra thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's things like The Lure, or like Happiness of the Katakuris, the Takashi Miike film, which is a kind of smorgasbord of like a million different genres, but there's a strong kind of horror element there. But I can't think of any horror musicals that are scary.
I know. I feel like somebody's missing a trick there, right? Like something that's really taken seriously as a horror film, but also a musical. Yeah. Maybe Sweeney Todd, does that do that? I mean, to a point.
Again, but I mean, it's, I don't know to what extent it's. I mean, I guess so. There's a kind of element there, but I guess maybe there's this idea that if you were to break into song, it would... How can you sustain fear if you break into song? But then if you look at a film like Dancer in the Dark, it's like, well, that can do pure, extreme, heart-wrenching melodrama.
Yes. And
people can break in song, but you go with it. It doesn't matter. I think you just have to be really smart with how it's done. I think, you know, a great, truly scary horror musical is... I'm waiting for it.
Yeah, so true. And I think you're right about that feeling of excess. I think there is something that works quite well with them both in a way. And I found from a lot of horror fans I've spoken to that there is a big cross-section of musicals fans as well. And I don't know what that is. I mean, there's almost that feeling when you watch a movie like Carrie, even, you know, like your favourite, and there's been a musical of Carrie, hasn't there? But there is almost that feeling that like the emotions are so heightened that they could burst into song at any moment. You could almost imagine it with certain horror films.
Yeah, and there's been a few like those kind of like subsequent musical adaptations, like a Evil Dead musical.
Yes.
There's a Toxic Avenger musical.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, so there's a few of those. So I think there's also something about maybe both horror fans and musical fans are equipped with this kind of suspension of disbelief that they have going in something. It's, you know, the idea of the ridiculous doesn't really matter. It's like that's part of the joy of both of these genres.
Yeah.
So maybe there is a kind of a nice match between them.
Yeah. Fulci, right? He could have done a good musical.
Oh my God, I'd have loved to have
Can you
seen
imagine? So with all that being said then, let's talk about Rocky Horror Picture Show. Michael, what's the story of Rocky Horror?
So Rocky Horror is about Brad and Janet, a newly engaged, very kind of straight-laced, emphasis on straight couple, who are traveling home. I think they're traveling back to see like a former professor who introduced them, to tell them news of their engagement. Along the way, on this kind of dark, stormy night, they get a flat tire and go to a nearby kind of castle that they see, a big, you know, huge mansion, not a castle, to use the telephone. And once there, they interrupt a very strange party run by Dr. Frankenfurter in celebration of his new creation that he's unveiling, who's this kind of beautiful Adonis named Rocky. And over the course of this long night, Brad and Janet are introduced to a whole new world that they've never seen or experienced before, and are kind of seduced by it to a certain way. And, you know, the extent of these strange people in this mansion's evil plan becomes clear.
Absolutely. So what do you think of tell me a bit about your sort of relationship and history with this film then?
Yeah, I first saw it when I was I guess I probably would have been about 13 or 14. It was on TV, and I remember that night my mum and my sister were out and I was home on my own, and I knew it was going to be on. It was on ITV, 9 o'clock. I remember so vividly,
yes,
you know, when it was going to be, and I sat down to watch it, and from the opening moment, you know, the lips, science fiction double feature, and that song, I just instantly like, this is incredible, this music. So I was totally hooked. I was drawn in. I was kind of loving it. Damn It, Janet came on. I was like, this is the best film I've ever seen. And then as it went on, and I knew vaguely what it was. I knew there was, you know, you'd seen images from it. You know, you think about lipstick and fishnets and these kind of things. And I knew there was something kind of queer about it. And it was, I guess, you know, at a time where I was really starting to understand myself, my own sexuality, and thinking about things and feeling scared about a lot of things too. But I remember as it went on thinking that I'd never seen anything before that was so unashamedly and joyfully queer as it was.
So frank, really, for its era, right? Yeah.
And I remember just thinking, like, I can't believe I'm watching this on regular TV, on like ITV. I can't believe there's other people across the UK also just sitting down with their like cup of tea and their piece of cake enjoying this as well. Like maybe families are watching this together, like, who knows? But I remember feeling almost quite scared by it. Like it felt too much for me to a certain extent. I was like, I don't know how to take all this in. Like, I feel excited and happy and joy, but I feel kind of fear, and I feel almost like I want to look away. Like, I felt a bit embarrassed by it. It was a kind of mixture of emotions, and I was recording it at the time. I used to record any film that was on. I used to record, and then, you know,
set the old VCR.
I'd record over it. And then I just watched it over and over again. You know, over the kind of months and years that followed. I was really obsessed with it. It was a really kind of important film for me at the time, as I think it is for a lot of people, and has been for a lot of queer people. But I think it is that feeling of, you know, before anything that I'd seen that dealt with queer characters was miserable. They were miserable. There was something in there that always made me think, I don't want this to be my life. Like, quite often, like, a lot of the fear that I had about my sexuality came from film, and particularly from TV, British TV of the time. And I think this was the first time that there was this moment where I saw something, was like, I can get on board with that. Yeah. You know, I wouldn't mind this being my life. I mean, you know, there's several aspects. Obviously, I wouldn't want the cannibalism and murder and stuff.
Wow.
Take that away. But, you know, the joy.
Yes.
You know, and the singing, you know, that kind of excess, the musical element to it, the camp, you know, there was something about it which was really, life-changing for me.
Yeah, I can totally get that. And there is still a kind of freedom about that film that I feel like still you don't get in a lot of mainstream movies, right? And just how joyous and celebratory it is of difference, I suppose, in whatever way, you know?
Yeah, there's like a genuine like subversion in there that's, you know, where else do you see that? You know, there's something that still feels, you know, it's an interesting film because, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about this in more detail, but it feels like incredibly dated in lots of ways, and it's, you know, there's certain aspects of it that haven't aged so well, and certain aspects of it that are becoming increasingly problematic as time goes on. But there is something generally kind of transgressive and subversive at its core that you can never take away from it and never stops being fascinating and joyful and exciting.
I had the same sort of experience in a way, in terms of like I'd kind of heard about it and I'd seen pictures of it, and obviously it had the word horror in the title, and I was a musicals fan as well, and I was really intrigued by it. There was something about it that felt kind of naughty almost, just from like having read about it and seen about it, and it's a very sexy film in a lot of ways, right?
Definitely.
Isn't it? Like, I think everybody finds that film incredibly sexy, incredibly alluring, I think. And, there's still something kind of really taboo in a really fun way, I think, about it the first time you see it.
Because the film's also like, it's also, and kind of to a certain extent, maybe it's more about straight people trying something new. That's what that kind of
it
film's
also
about.
kind of lets you, that's so true. It's also kind of going, look, this alternative sexuality or lifestyle is really fun. Why don't you give it a go? And I think you're right, even as a straight person or as whatever orientation, whatever gender you identify as, there's something fun and different and exciting about this.
And there's stuff around there, this idea of I don't know, like unleashing your kind of secret desires. And this idea of like kind of suburbanites behind closed doors trying on clothes and all that, that's kind of celebrated and put to the forefront in that film. And there is something, I think there's something very kind of British like response to that, about this kind of naughtiness, like you said, that's really interesting. And, when you go to see it and you see people kind of dressed up and, you get I think, go to a Rocky Horror Show and it's like one of the only places where you can see straight men in fishnets.
Yeah, totally.
That are like, I just love it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm here for. This is the one time of the year that I can do this outside of the house. Yeah,
it's so good. And that's the thing. And maybe that's a good time to talk about that this movie became this phenomenon, right? That didn't it have like one of the longest ever runs in a cinema, I think, because it was just on permanently, right? And people would go, and it became this tradition, this kind of ritual almost, that people go, they dress up, right? They bring props, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's the classic kind of cult movie, isn't it? It's the film that was made, it was a flop, it was wasn't a critical success.
Yeah.
And then it slowly found an audience who, word of mouth, it spread, people came to see it again and again, they got to know it, they got to know the lines, they got to call back at the screen, and there's a whole kind of, there's a whole community that goes with the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And, you go to a screening of it now, and particularly if you go and ever see a kind of stage production, and the first time you go, if you don't realise what's going to happen, having the audience kind of shout back at certain moments, and you go online and you can have a guide to how you watch Rocky Horror Picture Show, when to say things, what to do, how you kind of actively watch the film, and it was one of those kind of genuine cult classics that found that audience, it found that kind of thing, and it was, it's about, as we were saying, it's a film about otherness, and I think there's something that for queer audiences, and maybe particularly queer audiences at the time, and why it was so kind of embraced by the community, is there was nothing else really like that, and nothing else like that had really kind of moved into the mainstream and became, a kind of cultural phenomenon. So it's I think there's something there that's it's kind of the ultimate cult movie.
It really is, isn't it? It's the number one, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's kind of become the like textbook understanding of what we think of when we think about like what a cult movie is.
Yes.
And what so many films have tried to recreate, what so many films try and do when they want to be a cult film. But it's of course you can never want to be a cult film. If you're a cult film, it's decided by the audience, not the filmmaker.
So it's the sort of brainchild of Richard O'Brien, right? Isn't it? Essentially, I know it's not. He didn't direct the film, did he?
Yeah, it was Jim Sharman who directed.
That's it. Yeah. And he was working in sort of mainstream stage musicals at the time, right? But he was writing his own musical. This is somebody who was that outsider. He did identify as queer. He was also a massive horror fan, right? And I wonder if this is a good place to start at the beginning of the film and talk about literally the opening credits and the opening number, science fiction double feature.
And Flash Gordon was there in silver underwear. Claude Rains was the invisible man.
even in just this short 2-minute song, right, they mention a whole bunch of movie titles, many of which we've already covered this series during our Alien series.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's, I think there's like about 10, 15 movies that directly referenced, and then there's like plot elements of other movies referenced in opening songs.
I think it's like producers like George Powell. And,
exactly, like 25, 30 films listed in that kind of opening section. It really sets you up for like what this film is going to be.
As a nerd, it's an amazing song,
exactly.
Right?
So it's written by someone that loves B movies, that loves trash, that loves horror, that loves science fiction. It's also an amalgamation of a million different things.
Yeah.
That song is like, it's everything. It's everything thrown against the wall and we'll see what sticks. The thing about Rocky Horror Picture Show that people don't come for is the plot. This kind of engaging story. It's like, I've seen it, 50, 60 times probably, most of those between the ages of about 14 and 16. Yeah. It makes no sense still to me, and I still watch it. I'm like, I never quite understood what's happening there or what I'm supposed to feel in this movie. But it doesn't matter. Basically it's a collection of incredible songs written by Richard O'Brien, and there's a plot hung around them.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you do. But I think that kind of opening track sets you up for, it's like, it lets the right audience know you'll hear the right film, and if you're sitting there and you don't know what any of those films are, maybe you won't have quite as good a time.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing is like the one of the films that it doesn't reference that the film is probably most indebted to is The Old Dark House, which is the James Whale film, which is prototype Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's some kind of travellers who are in a storm and they end up at this old dark house with this
very
crazy
camp
family
in
there.
well,
exactly.
Right?
And there's something about this kind of monstrous other and kind of queerness that's very part of the old dark house. James Whale, who directed, was gay, and it's no coincidence that Rocky Horror kind of replicates to a certain extent the story from that. So it's kind of find it funny that it doesn't mention that film in the kind of opening. But yeah, I think that's the film out of all of those kind of 30s, 40s B-movie horrors that is the most kind of Rocky Horror-like.
And I think also, is it Richard O'Brien singing that opening number?
Yeah.
It is, isn't it? He doesn't have the best sort of, he doesn't have the voice that you'd associate with maybe musicals, right, as well. And I think there's something quite charming about that too, is that straight away the singing isn't even necessarily the sort of singing that you might hear in like a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical or an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical or anything like that, right? As well,
exactly. And you've got the lips of, I think they're Patricia Quinn's lips, who plays Magenta. So you've got these these disembodied lips, and you've got Richard O'Brien's kind of quite thin, kind of whiny voice. Yeah, and you have this moment of not only like, who is singing this? Are we going to see the rest of this face? But like, what gender is this voice? There's something, there's right from the beginning, it's playing with this idea of what we think, what we imagine, what we're putting onto something. So, it's like I said, it's like when I first saw it, and I'm sure you probably felt the same, and everyone did. It's like, if you're going to love that film within a minute.
100%.
Absolutely. If you respond to that straight away, you're going to have the fucking time of your life.
Late night, double feature. Picture show in the back row.
It's so true. And I think, like you said, I think you're right about the plot being kind of a little bit all over the place and a bit confusing. And I do often find every time I watch it that by about the sort of second half, I'm always like, what happens from this point onwards? Because it feels like most of the iconic moments happen in about the first 30, 40 minutes, don't they? And then you're like, what else is this film about? It's so funny the way it sort of goes off in the second half, I think, especially.
And the first half is better.
It's got the classics.
It's really front loaded with the best songs as well. The second half, it does kind of slow down slightly. And, it's almost like the second half is still great because the first half is so incredible.
You're right.
That, it does feel like it kind of peters out a little bit towards the end.
So Brad and Janet, I guess you'd call them sort of protagonists, right? Our sort of way into this world. Like you said, very much they're the sort of cookie cutter het couple, right? Aren't they? They're straight-laced as anything. What is their kind of role, I suppose, their importance in a story like this?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of... it sets you up that they're the protagonists, they're your kind of guides through this film. I mean, once they arrive, you quickly realise that Frankenfurter is the star of this show, and, he's who you care about. But I guess, they're really there as, kind of heteronormative, regular suburban America, and it's like this kind of juxtaposition between this kind of crazy queer life that's going on inside this mansion. So I guess they're these kind of over the top stereotypes of what it means to be the blandest, most boring people who are going to go on. They're literally getting engaged at the beginning, so they're at the start of what is going to be a very traditional life that they're going to lead. So you kind of need that to understand the journey that they go on. Essentially throughout the film, their eyes are opened up, and you need to kind of understand immediately who they are at the beginning of that film to kind of follow them on that journey and stuff. But I mean, Brad, he's all right. I mean, Janet's pretty fun. She's pretty wild. She
gets a great number later on, right?
Exactly.
One of the best.
Yeah. I feel like he kind of fades into the distance slightly. But...
He does a bit. And Susan Sarandon, of course, hero. Yeah, exactly. She does an amazing job in this.
Oh, it's nicer than Betty Monroe had. Oh, Brad. Now we're engaged, and I'm so glad that you met Mom and you know Dad. Oh, Brad. One thing to say, and that's Brad. I'm mad for you too.
Eventually, like you say, they get to this old dark house, and we meet this collection of crazy characters. First of all, we get the time warp, don't we? Before we meet Frankenfurter. That's the song that. Probably fair to say that's the song that's kind of sort of the most famous, I suppose,
definitely.
Number, right?
It's the one that you can't go to a wedding and the time doesn't come on, which I always find amazing as well when you've got like this kind of bunch of old straight granddads doing the time warp.
Yeah,
and you're like.
Why is it that song of all of them? Is it because it's got that almost kind of like novelty song vibe?
Yeah, exactly.
A jump to the left,
it's like, and there's nothing kind of outrageous in the lyrics as well.
No.
So it's kind of radio friendly. It's like the kids can do it. There's no mentions of kind of genderqueer lifestyles.
No, there's no sweet transvestites being mentioned. Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? It's great. And I'm sure there's probably so many people out there that know that song that have never seen Rocky Horror in their life. Right?
Exactly.
That's kind of transcended the film. That song, I think.
It's just a jump to the left. With your hands on your hips.
What do you think of all of these incredible characters that make up this party in this house? And before we even meet Frankenfurter, but obviously we meet Riff Raff Magenta and some of these others. What do you think of them?
Yeah,
and the costuming and everything else.
Yeah, you just love them all, don't you? It's like everyone's got their favourite. I'm a magenta boy myself, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's like it's that moment from when they first kind of go into the house, and like so much kind of happens. It's so exciting. You kind of meet all these different people, and by the time that Frankenfurter comes out, it's like
what's happening?
Like, yeah, exactly. It's like I can't take anymore.
Look, I'm cold, I'm wet, and I'm just plain scared.
I'm here with nothing to worry about.
How'd you do,
I think I read somewhere that I remember kind of reading once that originally what they wanted to do was the entire kind of first section of the film was going to be shot in black and white, and it wasn't going to be until Frankenfurter came down in that lift and there was the kind of the grate opened and there was that reveal that it was going to go into colour, so it was kind of like a Wizard of Oz type moment. Like
that's quite a cool idea.
Like they fully transition. They're in this kind of other place. They're in this kind of queer Oz.
Much of a man by the light of day, but by night I'm one hell of a lover.
The production design, I mean, the black and white would have even more so, I think, added to this idea that it feels like, again, you mentioned this when we talked about the opening credits, but it feels like it's made by somebody that knows and loves the genre, right? Everything from that production design, that house, the kind of hunched sort of servant person and everything. This is a movie, again, I suppose not really a horror film, right, in the traditional sense, but a film that is kind of soaked in horror, I suppose.
Exactly. I mean, there's no scares in Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's also, it's about the kind of horrors or the ability to escape the horrors of heteronormativity. Possibly. It's about the horrors of deviance and the horrors of otherness. So there's very kind of literal ways in which you can interpret the kind of horror references in that, but also the kind of just horrors of life that exist throughout that film.
You got caught with a flat world. How about that? Well, babies, don't you panic. By the light.
Let's talk about Frankenfurter then, because then you get that incredible entrance from Frankenfurter, Tim Curry. There is something quite imposing and scary about him at the same time as being incredibly sexy and exciting, right? I think it's kind of all there in that one character.
Yeah, exactly. And he's like, you know, the way he like embodies that is, you know, incredible. So yeah, like exactly what you said, you know, he's so alluring and you just want to, you know, you want to look at him, but you feel like threatened by him in some way. You feel like nervous and scared by him. You know, I think there's something, you know, again, particularly at that kind of time, this way that he's so unapologetic about you know who he is or who they are, you know how they express themselves, how they dress, how they speak, what they look like, all these kind of different things is it still feels confronting to a certain way, to a certain extent. You know, it feels radical and feels as exciting kind of in some ways now as it ever did. You know, and I feel like again it's that part of where you need to be with Brad and Janet for the first 15 minutes to really feel that shock of when you see, you know, Frank.
Well, there's something weirdly sort of really masculine but also really feminine about Tim Curry's performance, isn't there? Like at the same time, he's quite big and broad and imposing and muscular, but also he's this like beautiful, like it's just a really weird mix, isn't it? I think and I obviously know that countless people have played Frankenfurter on the stage and that kind of thing, but I can almost not imagine anyone but Tim Curry being that character.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of stage productions in my life, and you know, it's obviously no one's ever going to be that, but you can't help but pine for Tim. You know, whenever you're watching any other version. Yeah,
he's so good, isn't he? And you know, I guess such an interesting actor who's played probably one of the first actors that truly terrified me, because I've seen it at a sleepover when I was like 9 years old, you know, as well. And this guy he's so good at playing these kind of grotesque but extremely charismatic, I suppose, characters, isn't he?
Absolutely, yeah. Obviously, I mean, I was obsessed with Clue as well when I was a kid, so Tim Curry was a big part of my childhood.
Yeah, so good. Legend even. I mean, I loved it. Yeah, what a guy. What do you think of that first number when we first meet him then, that Sweet Transvestite moment?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a great iconic song. I mean, I think that's kind of that moment as well when you know, and I think that's something around that song which feels, you know, it's iconic, it's amazing, it's a great song, it's funny, and you know, all these kind of different things, but it is that moment where you start to feel, especially watching it now, there's a certain element of this film that's kind of aged, and a certain, you know, aspect of this film which perhaps doesn't kind of speak to audiences, particularly to queer and trans audiences, in the way that it might have done back then. You know, I think there's, you know, even just the use of the words of transvestite and transsexual are kind of outdated terms now, and I think it's what, you know, was once, or you know, has kind of been quite a celebratory anthem, now can become a little bit more difficult for certain audiences. You know, and I think that's something that's throughout the film. Is, as I said, there's kind of elements of it which haven't necessarily aged well, and mean that there is a, you know, like a significant kind of percentage of queer audiences that really don't like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and that's kind of the dialogue around that is becoming, you know, more so as time goes on. I think that something that's really not helped is Richard O'Brien, and he's been quite problematic when he's talked about gender identities over recent years. You know, he's someone who's previously, you know, he's identified as queer. He's talked about his, you know, that he's gender non-conforming in different ways. But he's also talked about himself as being this idea of the third sex. So he doesn't necessarily fully identify as male or female. He doesn't say that he identifies as gender non-binary, but he's used this term of third sex. But he's really outspokenly said that he doesn't think that trans women are women, for example. And he's been, you know, he's kind of agreed with, you know, really problematic things like people like Jermaine Greer have said about how, you know, a trans woman is a man pretending to be a woman. And, you know, it's upsetting and it's destructive for anyone to say something like that, but for someone that's created something like Rocky Horror Picture Show, how incredibly hurtful that must be for so many people who had their lives changed by that film, and that was such an important film for many people, many, not just queer and trans people, but many people, and to know that perhaps that person that created that wasn't the ally that you might have thought or wanted them to be, does leave a slightly sour taste in the mouth now when you watch the film and when you revisit it. I think that, you know, there's lots that you can put down to something being of its time,
Yeah.
You know, and I don't want to be that person that's like, oh, it's okay, it was of its time and stuff. But you know, there's something, and I think particularly around language, there's, you know, language evolves and we become more sophisticated in the way that we come up with the way that we use terminology, the way that people identify and self-identify is, you know, really important. I think it's something that people are, you know, that a lot of people, not everyone, of course, take really seriously. But you know, there's something when you think about, you know, what he was writing, why he was writing it, and I think there's an aspect in there as well of Frank, this central character who is genderqueer, but is a terrible person, you know, a murderer, a sexual predator, a cannibal, all these different things. And is there something in there about maybe even self-hatred functioning on some level? Is there something about, you know, Richard O'Brien's quite complicated and quite, you know, ultimately quite hurtful things that he said and ways that he's talked about gender identity. Can you see the seeds of that in the Rocky Horror Picture Show?
Right.
It's interesting to think about and talk about, but it does take away some of that joy. And for me, definitely, it's like, you know, when I watch it now, there's always the shadow of that, you know, lurking underneath it. And I'll never forget how it made me feel. I'll never forget how important that film was in my life. You know, I remember a couple of years ago at BFI Flair, which is the queer film festival that we run at BFI, and it was a Rocky Horror anniversary, and we talked about it, and we were like, are we gonna do Rocky Horror? And we decided that we were going to do it. We're going to show it at the IMAX, this, you know, dress up, sing along night.
Perfect.
And we talked about it a lot, and you know, talked about it with the programs that we're with, particularly one of the programmers who I used to work with called Jason Barker, who's a trans guy, and he talked a lot, and he talked really beautifully about what that film meant to him, and, you know, not just how much he enjoyed it as a kid and how exciting and all the things that we've talked about, but how much it made him think differently about gender. It made him think about himself, and it was really influential in shaping his kind of understanding of the world at that time. And that nothing will ever take that away, and that film does mean that for other people too. So we can still get together, we can still celebrate that film, we can still revel in the joy of it, and we can still, you know, acknowledge what it means. But I think it's also really important to acknowledge that it is and can be problematic in ways that go beyond some of the language that's used in that film.
Do you revisit the Friday the 13th movies often, or are you kind of done with them?
Oh, you know, I feel like I should be done with them, but I just can't seem to leave it alone. And just like it's this series is kind of like herpes for me.
It's just always with you.
It's always with me. It'll kind of go away for a little while, but then it just flares up.
Yes.
You know, and I just have to watch one or talk about it or something. I just really love this stupid series.
That was a little snippet you just heard there from my conversation with none other than Stacey Ponder, writer for the Final Girl blog, Rumorg magazine, host of the Gaylords of Darkness podcast. She's also been on this podcast a couple of times talking Martyrs and Invasion of the Body Snatchers with me, and she popped in for our little Friday the 13th special over on Patreon. We talked a little bit about her love for the series. We went through every single Friday the 13th movie and discussed our thoughts on the whole series, and we even did a little ranking at the end. And Stacey's quite the expert on these films. In fact, she's even had a book published in which she illustrated every single death in the Friday the 13th series. So it was such a joy to get to sit down and chat to her about this franchise. So if you want to hear that discussion, you can sign up to our Patreon at a $5 level, patreon.com/evolution of horror. If you sign up at $5 level, you will get at least 2 bonus episodes per month, including that one and a whole bunch of other sort of calendar specific reviews or anniversary discussions, mailbag episodes, a whole bunch of other stuff. You can also sign up at a $10 level, and then you will get bonus episodes every single week, and you'll also get access to our exclusive $10 mini-seasons, such as our Extreme mini-season, our Hellraiser mini-season, and our Alfred Hitchcock retrospective mini-season. So all of that is available to you on Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Everybody who signs up from the UK will get sent an Evolution of Horror sticker, and everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, no matter where you're from, will get a very special shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of July a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Patrick Teal, David Emerson, Kurd, Paul McCormack, Stephen Wykes, Gemma Pagno, Jane Wild, Wayne Powis, Howard Davis, Helen Lawless, Madison Keating Philipsky, Evan Woolham, Karis Turk, John Betts, the AC, the Community Development Podcast, David Budmeyer, Ben Matthews, Cassio Keyboard, Tracy Sumler, Paul Starkey, Free to Be Who I Be, PN Conan, Simon Tatum, Mike Cleopatra, Caroline Giles, Erica Leddock, Oliver Dunk, Dennis Simcott, Matthew Merris, Tyler, Ash Mills, Joshua Roberts, Joshua Bennett, and Eric L. Anderson. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon in the month of July. And don't forget, if you want to join them and if you want to get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. That's patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Okay, at this point in the episode, we're going to pause my discussion with Michael Blyth. We'll be talking about the latter half of the film a little bit later on in the episode. But first of all, I sat down to chat with film historian, musician, and all-round musicals guru, Neil Brand. Neil Brand, for those of you who don't know, he presents a whole bunch of really brilliant BBC shows, including The Sound of Song, The Sound of Cinema, and recently he did The Sound of Musicals, where he tracked the whole history and the evolution of the musical across, I think it was a 3 or possibly 4 episode BBC series. It's really fantastic. You should check it out if you get the chance. So he was the perfect person to sit down and chat to me about the impact of the Rocky Horror Picture Show from a musical's perspective. Here is my discussion with the brilliant Neil Brand. All right, I'm very excited to welcome back to the podcast the brilliant Neil Brand. Hello, Neil.
Hello, Mike. Nice to see you.
Lovely to see you again. How's this strange year, this last year, been for you?
Well, all right. I hate to start on a political note, but I'm one of the excluded. So, because we run a company, we haven't had any help from the government over the last few months. And yes. I normally earn most of my money from live shows. So that has been quite a challenge. But I'm very, very grateful to the people who have commissioned me for stuff. I'm doing some private commissions and I'm doing bits and bobs of recording and broadcasting.
Well, I love some of the broadcast stuff that you've done, Neil, and actually I think it was during lockdown that I finally got to watch your series on the history of musicals, of movie musicals. I think they replayed it over the Christmas period, and it was such a joy, and that's why I'm here to ask you a little bit about musicals, and particularly horror musicals. These are on paper 2 very, very different genres, right? But how well do you think they blend? Do they complement each other in any way, in your opinion?
I think they blend very well, but then I would say that because one of my other favourite genres is the horror comedy.
Yes.
And horror comedy as a way of both getting laughs and chills when it's done well is one of the real pleasures. It's also partially because, as I told you last time, I find it quite hard to sit through horror films because I hate being made to jump particularly, but there's something really clever about something where you are killing yourself laughing, but at the same time, you are in a state of tension about it. And some of the great horror comedies, I'd include films like Bride of Frankenstein in there, where you have an element of absurdity to it, which is going to then tip over into comedy pretty quickly. I did a score many years ago for the silent version of The Cat and the Canary. And The Cat and the Canary is one of the first spooky house movies where a bunch of relatives are coming to hear the reading of the will and then are going to get bumped off one by one.
Yeah.
But it's done with such tongue-in-cheek and panache. And to be frank, if anybody attempted to do it seriously, it would not work. So then when you go next stage, bung-in songs, yeah. And I think it's really interesting that what we're talking about here, of course, is a musical that draws its influences from 50s horror. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's also got the old Universal horror in there as well. But it's mainly the horror sci-fi genre. And again, another genre that works at its best when it's done with humor, when it's done with a certain amount of a kind of sharing a joke that you're watching something that simply could not happen.
What's your own sort of history and memories of that film? Do you remember the first time you ever saw Rocky Horror? Have you always been a fan of the movie? Tell me a bit about that.
Very much so. And I suspect the first time I saw it was in the 1980s on TV. Uh-huh. And I don't know when it was first shown on TV. But not long after that, I went to one of the legendary live shows where we had to take, you know, newspapers put on our heads and rice. And there were people got up on stage and did some of the dialogue, and we all joined in the song. And it was one of the first times, I think, it might even have predated Sound of Music, when the cinemas invited a kind of sing-along audience to come and join in what was happening in the film. These were obviously people who'd seen the film a million times. Mm. You could say that Rocky Horror Show is actually a child of the VHS revolution. Yeah. Because you had to have seen it a lot before you could join in with that, really. And of course it was on VHS. And then we went and saw it in the West End. And I think it was Nicholas Parsons as the criminologist. So the criminologist in the original film, Charles Gray, is just magnificent because he doesn't for a moment give away that he's part of a joke. Yeah. Or at least he sort of does. But I think, it's the first time I'd seen that kind of camp, posh, scary, villainous type on film. And that then is just now part and parcel of our DNA, all of those elements. Richard O'Brien, I think, was, I don't know if the sort of thing interests you, but for as far as I know, Richard O'Brien was actually involved, I think, in the chorus of Jesus Christ Superstar. Yes. And this drove him to want to write something that was as unlike Jesus Christ Superstar as possible. Yeah, well, it's amazing. Actually, quoting you from your Sound of Musicals BBC show, I think you mentioned that he was also, I think he was Herod's understudy or something like that. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Yes, he was Herod's understudy. Which is brilliant, isn't it? And speaking of Jesus Christ Superstar, I mean, let me ask you a little bit about the sort of the backdrop of what the sort of climate of musicals was like, I suppose, in the early 70s, because it seems to me, sort of generally speaking, when looking back, that as opposed to horror, musicals always seem to have quite a good reputation, right? Quite a reputable genre. And all through the 60s, you had a load of major sort of what seemed like Best Picture winners and big epics, you know, from Sound of Music to My Fair Lady to Oliver and these types of things. What sort of did that sort of change in the 1970s in terms of what was trendy, I suppose, in musicals? Very much so. I think even by the mid-1960s, the musicals that were being shown on stage, and particularly the musicals turning up in cinema, were aimed at the parents. They were aimed at an older generation who loved all that kind of thing. Whereas the younger generation actually wanted something aimed at them. And I think this was, I mean, Jesus Christ Superstar was, you can take nothing away from this show, was a major event in musical theatre. I remember it was the first time I thought, wow, you can use that kind of music, can you, to tell a story, let alone that story of all of them. Now who'd you think beside yourself was a pick of a crop? Yeah, so Jesus Christ Superstar, obviously written by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. It's what you might think initially as quite a conservative sounding story, right? This is literally the story of Jesus Christ, and but it's done in the style of a rock opera, right? So you had this kind of really interesting kind of glam rock, prog rock stuff mixed with traditional musical theatre, and a great idea for a musical that would appeal to both younger people and the parents and grandparents, right? And it weirdly went straight into a fairly establishment theatrical presentation. I mean, Jesus Christ Superstar, if I remember rightly, was running for years and years and years at the Palace Theatre in the West End. Now, that's one of the biggest, one of the prestige theatres. It's also expensive to fill. So you've got to be damn sure you've got a show that is going to get full houses night after night after night after night after night. So even when the show finally happened, and of course it happened after the album was released, because releasing the album was what sold the tickets for people to go and see the show, it had already entered a kind of acceptance, a kind of establishment audience who wanted to see it. And it really helped that Robert Stigwood was involved, major promoter. So it was halfway between a musical and a rock concert with all the promotional possibilities that entailed. Rocky Horror, meanwhile, had to kind of sneak into the West End. And I think I'm right in saying it started somewhere like the Arts Theatre. And it was lo-fi right through. I mean, it's a smallish band. It's a show that sort of, lighting, smoke and noise. But apart from that, there's nothing massive. You've got nobody being crucified on a rising cross in the middle of the stage. Nothing like that. If I remember rightly, the Meatloaf character is killed by Frankenfurter in the original show by being pushed into the ice cream freezer on the side of the stage and then murdered with the microphone stand. So it was all very lo-fi.
Yeah.
But also it was getting an alternative audience. It was getting a fringe audience. Youngsters, obviously big gay following. Anybody who was into stuff that was camp. It had a nightclub feel to it. It was dealing with songs and issues that at the time would probably have really struggled to find their way onto a major stage or even a major screen. And I think Richard O'Brien just exactly knew what he was doing with it.
It's true, he did. And it was so, like you say, this was so much more niche even than something like Jesus Christ Superstar, right, which had that mass appeal. But I wondered, what about sort of early 70s film musicals like Cabaret? That was quite a boundary-pushing musical, right? I wonder if that might have had some kind of influence as well on Rocky Horror.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome.
Yeah, I think the point that we were making with the movie musical show, and it's one really that took the research to do the series to come across it really, was that what could be considered the musical for mums and dads priced itself out of the market in the 1960s. Yeah. There were 4 or 5 massive musical flops, including Hello Dolly being one of the biggest ones, which was a perfectly serviceable show. Streisand as the star, Gene Kelly as the director. I mean, come on. If you were going to put money on a film, that would have been it. And of course, they put millions into it. And it lost so much. And then, of course, the big stuff like Paint Your Wagon, which was always going to be a bit of a disaster. Clint Eastwood singing I Talk to the Trees, I mean, please. And Star, there were several big, massive flops. So then with Fosse making Cabaret, what he's doing is he's actually taking the idea of something which is both darker and more relevant to people's ordinary lives. None of the shows that I've just described are in any way coming up from the streets. They're all a kind of big, glamorous view of what life could potentially be. And by 1970, nobody wants that. Nobody believes it anymore. You've had the Vietnam War. You've had, most of the sort of, the hippie era is over and done with. It doesn't feel like a time to be celebrating what could be to the same degree. And I think Fosse with Cabaret celebrates sort of what is. You can't get away from it. The moment we see the swastika in Tomorrow Belongs to Me, the moment he's beaten up, the abortion, all those those play into concerns that people reacted to with far more sort of understanding. It was a very, very smart film from that point of view, and yet, without a doubt, a musical with its very camp elements to it. The band in the Kit Kat Club, the whole idea of a nightclub atmosphere, from which these stories, these vignettes, and these songs can come. That, I think, was exactly the same background that O'Brien was drawing on when he was doing Rocky Horror, for obviously very different reasons and to very different ends.
Yes, let me ask you a little bit about the music itself then, these Richard O'Brien songs. Again, how sort of typical or atypical are they of musicals? How would you define the kind of the style of music, I suppose, in Rocky Horror?
It's a lot of rock and roll, very good rock and roll. And coming and heading over towards fairly heavy rock at that.
Yeah.
So rather than just recreating slightly sugary 50s and 60s rock and roll, or even Spectre style rock and roll, because actually you have got a sort of there's a Spectre element to Little Shop of Horrors, but Rocky Horror Show actually is fairly centrally in the hard rock world. You've got just brilliant sing-along foot tappy numbers. I mean, Time Warp is just magnificent, and every single note sounds like it's been planned down to the last minute, and I bet it was.
It's astounding. Time is fleeting.
And as soon as you hear the first line, it's astounding. That tick, 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 tick. Very, very tight rock. That's my favourite of the lot. Even just mentioning that, I feel a bit of a chill going down the back of my neck.
Keep control.
It's so celebrational. It just feels wonderful. There's a light burning in the Frankenstein place. That first introduction of where Brad and Janet are going to go, touch it, touch it, touch me. Oh my God! So no one else had written a number like that.
Yeah.
I've got an itch to scratch. I need assistance. Touch it, touch it, touch it, touch me. I wanna be dirty.
And again, I think this was the knowledge they weren't going to be showing this play or this musical on a stage where anybody was going to be paying more than £15 a ticket, I think, meant that he could get away with it. And he knew he could get away with it. And then all of the sort of, they're pastiches, but they're not pastiches for their own sake.
Yeah.
I like the fact that all the songs in it do progress the plot. This is another element of musical theatre that I think is really important. There's no point in just let's stop for a bit of a laugh. Let's actually find out more about character with this. Brad and Janet as uptight Americans losing their inhibitions, and actually losing their inhibitions through music as much as through anything else. I think that too is a really lovely trope that isn't done enough. So their first numbers together are all fairly straight. You know, there's a bit of rock behind it, but they're sung by people who aren't used to singing rock and roll.
Yeah.
Which is the other thing that makes Touch It, Touch It, Touch Me so good, because by that time she's bought in 100% to this transgressive world that she's found herself in, and it just works.
I think it's fascinating as well, very clever, like you mentioned, the style of the music in Rocky Horror, that it has got this kind of almost innocence to it, right? The sort of 50s rock and roll style. And it's something you talked about on your BBC show about the song Touch It, Touch Me, for example, which, when you hear it played, like when you hear you play it on the piano, it sounds like this really lovely, innocent, nostalgic tune. And then, of course, the lyrics are something so much more daring. And I guess that's what makes all of the subject matter in Rocky Horror a little bit more palatable, right? Is that the music is so kind of almost sounds like fun for all the family in the actual music.
Yeah. And those tunes are very, very tuneful.
Yeah.
And then that sense of innocence, as you say, that's really why it still works as well as it does. And the absurdities within that are just beautifully put together. It's very fine comedy as well as a good musical. And indeed, a good horror movie. It's really quite a shock in the film when Frankenfurter whips the tablecloth off the table, and there's Eddie under glass with all his stomach hanging out. And it's like kind of, oh my God. So he actually did kill him with that meat cutter thing. which is so 70s. An electrical meat cutter.
Yeah. It is, isn't it?
You might as well have had a tease made there, or a heated trolley.
Yeah. What do you think has been the sort of the legacy of Rocky Horror in sort of horror? Well, actually, in musicals as well. I mean, it seems so unique, but do you think that Rocky Horror then kind of in any way changed or influenced the musical, either on stage or in cinema?
Yeah, although not, unfortunately, the mainstream musical. Mainstream musicals in the 80s, of course, went even further down the Cats and Les Mis and all the rest of it line, where you had a certain amount of rock involved there. But at the end of the day, it's pretty conservative rock, certainly compared with Rocky Horror. I think what it did do more than anything else was just prove to people who wanted to get a show on its feet with a band that was using rock to tell a story that it could be done and could be done small. So actually shows like Rent undoubtedly couldn't have happened without Rocky Horror.
Yeah.
Obviously, Little Shop of Horrors, which is coming from the same place. There's loads of shows that where you've basically got a band of 4 or 5 and they rock out the story at you. So there's quite a few of those. So I think it proved you didn't need to rebuild a theatre to put your show in, which they were blithely doing all through the 1980s. And also that people who could write good rock numbers could write musicals.
Yeah.
I think the musical up until then had been, it had to be done by people who understood Rodgers and Hammerstein, gave over their lives to sort of finding exactly the right song for exactly the right moment. Whereas actually, if you came up with a bunch of really quite good numbers and could link them, then off you go.
Yes.
And that whole performative thing, whereby nobody in Rocky Horror does a number without coming to the front of the stage and being lit.
Yeah.
So there's no attempt to suggest that these numbers are happening in any kind of reality. They're really not. We're going in a performance here, and bloody look at me.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is something that Rocky Horror did very well quite early on, and that's now become pretty much standard musical fare. All of the musicals in the West End that have come out of a kind of jukebox world. So stuff like Tina and Mamma Mia and stuff like that, for sure. But even shows like Book of Mormon, where you have a sense of absurd performatism about it, that you've got a bunch of Mormons ringing doorbells, and yet these are also performers who are aware of just how camp and, for the most part, usually gorgeous they are, drawing attention to what they're doing with a kind of a rock beat behind what they're doing. And particularly the transgressive side of Book of Mormon, because there's some horrific stuff going on in that show that works brilliantly, partially because it's pitched in such a perfect fashion, but also because the music takes some of the sting out of what it's doing.
Before we wrap up, Neil, I want to go back to the topic of horror musicals. You know so much more about musicals than I do, but to your knowledge, have there been any horror musicals, either before or since Rocky Horror, that have been as successful as this in terms of kind of blending the sensibilities and the genres together?
Not that I can think of. No. I mean, there are horrific elements in some of the big musicals, insofar as, you see somebody dying horribly on stage or committing suicide or whatever. But this just comes out of a melodrama world of theatre anyway. But no, not where they'd really gone for broke for proper horror or proper horror tropes. There aren't even, as far as I know, science fiction musicals per se. Or if there are, they're treated in a very kind of coy and slightly sugary way. I think because what before the 70s, what a musical was always assumed to be something rather gorgeous with lots of people tapping or high kicking or whatever. So, no one was going to try and do Forbidden Planet under those circumstances. But of course, then Bob Carlton does Forbidden Planet with a band playing the instruments as well. But Forbidden Planet's only so horrific. It's sci-fi, first and foremost. It's and I don't think there's ever been a film of Bob Carlton's version of Forbidden Planet. So it's a harder one to pull off. There have been lots of Dracula stage shows, but no Dracula musical. And I've seen 2 or 3 musical theatre workshops where people have tried to do Dracula, and it's bloody difficult. The most difficult thing being, how do you get a monster singing?
What about Sweeney Todd, though, Neil? Surely that is another kind of prime example, right, of blending kind of quite grisly, serious horror with serious musical, Stephen Sondheim.
There's a hole in the world like a great black pit, and it's filled with people who are filled with shit, and the vermin of the world inhabit it. But not for long.
Obviously famously adapted into a film starring Johnny Depp, directed by Tim Burton. In a way, Tim Burton, quite good for that kind of a gig. He's done sort of horror-tinged musicals, I suppose, like even The Nightmare Before Christmas. Are you a fan of Sweeney Todd, Neil?
I'm a big fan of Sweeney Todd, the show. I regret to say I've not seen the Tim Burton version because I went through a real aversion to Tim Burton for a while. I just had it with Tim Burton. I just could not be watching another bloody Tim Burton.
I totally agree. Yeah,
but also because my memories of the show were so good, and the musical, the Sondheim musical, is, I think, an astonishing, real work of art. For me, it's one of his greatest shows and one of the greatest musicals ever written, because it takes the literary tradition of Sweeney Todd. Based on a play, but and obviously it doesn't stint on the throat cutting. There's a lot of blood. There's there's madness. There's horror. It's all tied back to a kind of to a sort of Victorian industrialized world in which these sort of things are commonplace. And the music is, you can hear a mind beginning to shatter through the course of the show. You get just where Sweeney is and his downward descent. But I think maybe I'd like to see Sweeney Todd on film directed by somebody other than Tim Burton.
Yes.
And it kind of pissed me off that he wouldn't release it he wouldn't promote it as a musical. He promoted it as a Tim Burton horror film.
There was not a single song or bit of music in the trailer, which is so stupid because this is a hardcore musical, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is singing from beginning to end.
Yeah, it's true song. And then people went and sat there going, "What am I watching?" For goodness sake!
Oh, no,
but it also struck me that if he was that unconfident about the original material to not want to mention in the promotion that it was a musical. He probably hadn't done that great a job with it. So, I put up my hand. I haven't seen the film, so I'm prepared to be proved wrong.
Well, do you know what? It's not bad. I've rewatched it recently, and I'm exactly the same as you. I really went off him, particularly around this time in the sort of 2000s when he was doing Alice in Wonderland and all that other crap with Johnny Depp.
Yeah.
And this is probably the best film he's done in about 20 years, and that's because he's using such good material as it is, really. I think that's the thing. But so there you go. Rocky Horror, to finish with, I mean... there are so many musicals that come and go and disappear into obscurity. Others obviously stay in London's West End for decades and decades. What is it about Rocky Horror that makes it one of those, it seems to be at least one of those types of shows that has stood the test of time? Why do you think that is?
I think because it somehow, even though it was drawing on the 50s and music and sci-fi tropes of the 50s, it managed to create something timeless. And I think that timelessness is about a unique little world of the Frankenfurter house and these strange aliens and the people caught up with them. That is always worth revisiting, in the same way as the completely fabricated world of P.G. Wodehouse is always worth going back to time and again. You escape into it because it's a place that's got fun and sex and great tunes and great music in it, so that will keep you coming back. It's not trying to push an improving message down your throat. It is just there for fun and to enjoy. So I think that will always be the case, and it's never going to go away, because also you can mount it almost on a scout hut stage with
Yes.
with a good piano player and a bass player and a drummer, and it will still work because everything about it is about performance. Doesn't matter if you haven't got a big spooky house behind you. The show is in the songs and the text and the thoughts behind it.
It's so true. Neil, thank you so much. It's always an absolute pleasure. And just tell us, is there anything out there, hopefully, fingers crossed, the world is going to be opening up again. If people want to find any information about anything you've got coming up, any gigs or anything similar, where's best to find it?
Well, I've got a website, which is www.neilbrand.com. I put what I'm doing on there, although it's been empty for a year and a half.
Of course.
But I'm doing a gig. I'm doing a Buster Keaton gig at the National Film Theatre, and I've got these Laurel and Hardy films coming up. There will be stuff.
Fantastic. Neil, thank you so much for joining me.
Cheers, Mike.
A big thank you to the wonderful Neil Brand. So we're going to now head into the second half of my discussion with Michael Blyth as we continue discussing in spoilerific detail the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
It's not often we receive visitors here, let alone offer them hospitality.
Hospitality? All we wanted to do was to use your telephone, God damn it, a reasonable request which you've chosen to ignore.
Dad, don't be ungrateful.
Ungrateful?
How forceful you are, Brad. Such a perfect specimen of manhood.
Michael, let's talk a little bit about the actual filmmaking itself here. We haven't really talked about Jim Sharman as a director and what he brings to the film. It really looks quite sort of rough and ready, doesn't it? What do you think that kind of brings to the experience?
I mean, I think with Rocky Horror, it's like... I mean this in the most loving way, but it's not a very good film. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's pretty ropey, and not just because it's low budget and it was shot over a short period of time, but it's like, Jim Sharman, thank you for bringing this film and directing this film and, bringing it into my life. But, he's not a very good filmmaker. It's a bit, it's clunky. It's the storytelling's awkward.
Yes.
It's, it feels a little bit amateurish sometimes. That's all part of its joy. It's all part of its charm. I don't want to see the glossy, polished version. It's like, it should be rough and ready. It should be low budget. It should feel a bit naff.
Yeah.
It's all those things. And, maybe there's an aspect of that was deliberate. Maybe that's about being part of the homage to kind of 50s B movies.
Yeah.
I kind of don't think it is. I think it's just not, it's just not a particularly well-made film.
Yeah, you get the feeling it's a bit rough and ready, I suppose, don't you?
But it doesn't matter because the film is about the songs. That's what it's about. Like, it's the songs that not get you through it. It's not like an endurance exercise. There's plenty that happens in between the songs. It's great, but it's punctuated by these songs that are just incredible. You love them. You fall in love with the music. That's why you fall in love with the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yes.
I don't know anyone who has loved that film in their life that hasn't owned the soundtrack at some point.
No.
You just do. True. You just need to have it. So I think that it doesn't really matter about, it's how it looks, how it's made, how it, that's not what it's about. So, so it's almost like it's a film that is of its time, but it was a film that was never like any other film, so it kind of doesn't age in lots of ways.
It's weird, isn't it?
It looked crap then, it looks crap now. It looked beautiful then, it looks beautiful now. It's all those different things.
There are certain images that are stunning still, aren't there? And then, like you say, there are some ropier bits. And it's that weird mix of kind of, you've got sort of 30s Universal horror, you've got kind of 50s sci-fi alien horror, you've also got 70s kind of glam rock, right, as well, and you've got Meatloaf, and that kind of thing as well, where it suddenly really reminds you, oh yes, we're actually in the mid-1970s.
Yeah, exactly. I used to hate that Meatloaf song when I was a kid. That was always one of my least favorites. But now it's one of my faves. Yeah. I love it.
What is your favourite track?
I mean, for me, it's the first two, the double hitter of science fiction double feature and then Damn It, Janet. I just love those two. The Eddie's song, the Meatloaf track is Hop Tootie is one of my faves as well.
Let me ask you, I mean, we've already said the story is pretty thin, but what do you think of this kind of this whole set piece where they bring Rocky to life then, I suppose, and this introduction of Rocky as this kind of monstrous Frankenstein creature type thing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that was the thing, like when I was, this was when I watched it when I was a kid, where the idea of this kind of queerness like really was so overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
It was this idea of, this kind of crazy scientist creating this man for pleasure,
yes,
for his, for their own pleasure. And that was what was so mind-blowing to me, was it wasn't just, this was about like dressing up, or this was about kind of self-expression and being kind of queer in different celebratory ways. It was also about sex, and it was also about this idea of not being ashamed about who you want to have sex with, and not just not being ashamed, throwing a fucking party so you can show all your friends who you want to have sex with. And that person being this guy. I mean, I always think the kind of one of the things that that I wish was different in Rocky Horror Picture Show was that Rocky was a bit hotter, but he's got
weird hair,
weird looking guy.
He's quite
but anyway,
weird. But it's his body, isn't it, as well? I mean, he is exactly. And again, it's something that quite unusual, but just having that male body objectified so much for just like most of the film from that point onwards, right?
Exactly. And then when they kind of go off arm in arm together, and it's got the just married thing, and also it's funny, and they're there, and you think literally the curtains closing, it's like they're gonna fuck now, like this is incredible. My mind was literally like racing, like I couldn't believe what I was seeing on screen. But also you think this idea of like just married, and this idea of there's something about that is like it's a joke about gay rights, it's a joke about not being able to get married, it's a joke about like what's kind of happening. So there's something kind of celebratory, there's a little undercurrent of politics going on there. There's an awareness, and there's something, it's saying something, it's trying to do something. But ultimately that was what I found so exciting, was this is a celebration of queer sex. And I'd never seen that before. I think that was the thing. Even you'd seen sex scenes, they'd seen moments, there'd bits that in films I'd rewind and watch over and over again, but I'd never seen something that was so much about like literally have sex with who you want to have sex with, like to the point where he'd created someone. Again, one of the things that's really problematic about it, which I didn't really get at the time, which I very much do now, is the fact that it's non-consensual. Rocky doesn't really want to have sex with Frank. I think he's clearly uncomfortable from the beginning and spends most of the film trying to run away from Frank. So there is that element. He's also very naive and quite childlike. There's something that the older I get becomes even more disturbing about, when he's singing about how he's only 7 hours old.
Oh my God.
So there is a kind of aspect of it that unquestionably positions Frank as a sexual predator, which is again happens when they visit Brad and Janet
in the beds.
In the beds.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That is the moment that I remember really kind of shocking / exciting me the first time I saw it, because this was them actually showing like all of these people at it in various beds and with various different combinations of people, right? As well. But
exactly. So, and there's that thing. It is funny and it's exciting, and you think and it's partly about, I guess, what they're going for is this idea about sexual liberation and sleep with who you want to sleep with and stuff. But both Brad and Janet, Frank pretends to be someone else to get into their bed, and to a certain it's only when they're having sex that they're like, oh my God, it's you. So there is something, and I think conversations around consent are you can't have you can't look at Rocky Horror now and not have that idea of kind of consent running through, and I think it's another thing that just adds a slightly kind of different edge to it, and a slightly kind of difficult edge to it when you watch it now.
You're right, you're totally right. I think because I saw it so many years ago, I never really thought about it, but it's so true. It's just so it's so sort of out there and wacky and grotesque and weird that I kind of almost don't even acknowledge that side of it, I think, when that sort of stuff comes up. But it's true, it's so interesting to think about. So then, I mean, what else can we discuss? I mean, I guess, how do you find the way that the film then kind of goes into that sort of big sort of cabaret show, RKO type thing, right? Doesn't it? In the sort of latter half of the movie. What do you think of all of that stuff?
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like when it moves into that, you kind of expect that it's going into this, this different section of the film. And it is going to be more of a show. But it's kind of not. It's like the show that never really gets going.
That's
and it becomes quite dark and quite, like kind of downbeat and slow, that final section. There's a kind of couple of songs in a row that are pretty kind of like kind of sad, whiny numbers. Some great stuff in there, don't get me wrong, but it kind of it doesn't build to this exciting fireworks crescendo. It ends quite depressingly, and this kind of peters out slightly towards the end. I'm okay with that. I'm fine with that. It's that's what it is. That's what the film is. But I think that it's just, like we said, the second half just isn't quite as good as that first half. I think that it's the thing that's great about the final section, that kind of final act, is the don't dream it, be it. That when that line is repeated over and over again, and they're singing this idea of don't dream it, be it, and it's that feels like it's such a mantra that you can live your life by, and that queer people can really embrace. It's like that's when this film becomes about, and it's why the film still today has so much power and it's so affecting to me, is because it is about this idea of just be who you want to be. I mean, it sounds like cliche the way I'm describing it, but it's it's the way it's repeated, the way you kind of understand how you don't do that, whether it's through sex, self-expression, clothes, whatever it might be. It's still a really beautiful, powerful message.
So true.
So that's so I guess you watch Rocky Horror now and you choose what to almost kind of push to one side and ignore, and what to grab onto, and at the end there is this beautiful message that you can, and that queer people can still embrace, and that can live their lives by. And it's this film for lots of people was a really important part of their coming out process, whether coming out as gay or queer or trans, and this idea of you can be this person you want to be is always powerful. It's always powerful to think about that, and there's still people now that will be a powerful message for.
Totally. And I suppose, I should ask you about the fact that there is this kind of reveal that they're aliens, right, as well. I mean, talking about this in a kind of Alien series context, I mean, is there much more to that? I mean, is there... it's not really a film, is it, that spends a lot of time or... doesn't have much to explore in terms of this being a quote-unquote alien horror movie, does it? Or sci-fi movie?
Yeah, I mean, it literally doesn't matter that they're aliens.
No.
I mean, it's I feel like you could watch that and every time be like, oh yeah, I'd kind of forgotten this is kind of what
that weird twist.
And, it's it's cute and it's fun. They've got the little cheesy special effects as they're shooting at Frank. I love the idea of this, Frankenfurter is this genderqueer alien that's kind of traveling around trying to find this queer utopia that they want to build and that they want to create. And this idea of feeling out of place, this idea of feeling, unloved and not understood. And, I think that's something about Frank that we, and, when I say we, particularly we as queer people, really identify and understand with. Understand. And I think that sometimes, I've talked a little bit about how Frank is a problematic character in lots of ways, but he's also iconic in lots of ways. And there is something about his struggle and his pain and that's part of that film too. And I don't want to kind of ignore that, because that was something that was really meaningful to me, especially when I was younger and I used to watch the film. So I think this idea of feeling out of place, feeling alien is part of that kind of queer narrative of Rocky Horror. So I think the kind of alien aspect is actually really important to it. But it's just not really important to it in terms of storytelling, because the way it's revealed and the way it's explained doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not important to the narrative at all, but I think that's so true, because I've talked a lot so far this series about how the alien is a good device, I suppose, for being, for talking about the other in whatever way that might be, whether it's in a bad way or a good way, whether it's communists or, whatever it might be. And I suppose this is such an important one in regards to kind of, it's about celebrating being that alien, being that other, embracing your otherness, I suppose, in a way.
Don't dream it, just be that alien.
Yeah, exactly. So there you go. I mean, is there anything else you want to mention on Rocky Horror? Anything we've forgotten to discuss that you want to bring up?
Well, I think you can't talk about Rocky Horror and not talk about Shock Treatment.
Oh, of course. The sequel.
The kind of sequel. I think on the poster it was not a sequel, not a prequel, but an equal.
I'm not a locum with no to suture myself. I've been a cynic for too many years. Playing doctor and nurse, it can be good for your health. I've seen clinics with those gimmicks.
No, I've never seen it.
Oh my god, Mike! Okay, can we pause? Yeah. We're just going to go and watch it now. And we'll be back in a second.
I know.
So this is my secret, my little confession, and maybe lots of avid Rocky Horror fans will switch off, but I prefer Shock Treatment.
Oh, interesting.
I'm a huge Shock Treatment fan. I think it's partly because sometimes you just go for the underdog and you want to kind of give the attention. It's like, I don't need to tell everyone I love Rocky Horror Picture Show. I want to talk to them about Shock Treatment.
Sure.
So Shock Treatment was, again, Rich O'Brien musical, follow-up to Rocky Horror Picture Show. Jim Sharman directed, again. And it's set in the same kind of world of Rocky Horror. So Brad and Janet are the central characters in it.
Right.
And the kind of setup of that film is that it's almost like the town of Denton is essentially like exists purely on TV. And it's like the residents, the TV audience, and the characters exist in different TV shows. And Brad and Janet, who are having a tough time with their marriage, go on this show called Marriage Maze. And all sorts of crazy stuff happens. I mean, it's like, if you think Rocky Horror doesn't make any sense, Shock Treatment makes even less sense. It's like, no matter how many times I watch that film, I have no idea what's going on.
Amazing.
But it doesn't necessarily matter. I think it's super interesting in that it's genuinely a film that anticipates this idea of reality TV and how, reality and fiction blur in terms of storytelling and how we live our lives through other people. I think there's lots of really interesting stuff going on there. But I think the thing about Shock Treatment, same with Rocky Horror, is the songs. But with Shock Treatment, the songs are less instant. It doesn't have that necessarily that science fiction double feature or that Sweet Transvestite, that time warp moment. There's a song called Bitchin' in the Kitchen, which is pretty is the one that's like, you've got a real hook to it, that one. But a lot of them, they just kind of wash over you. And it's with repeated viewings that you get to realise how smart and interesting this soundtrack is. It's a bit more kind of punk new wave sometimes than Rocky Horror.
Interesting.
But over the years, and I've grown to love it more and more, and now I think that the songs in Shock Treatment are even better than the songs in Rocky Horror Picture Show. Just different, not quite as iconic, but they're growers. But I recommend to anyone that hasn't seen it to check it out. I think that the part of why Shock Treatment isn't really a thing that people talk about, and people, and even a lot of people that love Rocky Horror, like you saying, like, they've just never watched it. I think it was like Rocky Horror, it was a big flop when it came out, but I think the thing that people didn't respond to was, I think that Shock Treatment, they tried to replicate what they did with Rocky Horror. So like I said, you can't make a cult film. It's a cult film's created after you make it. I think they tried to make a cult movie. Right. They tried to do this again, and it didn't feel as authentic. It didn't feel like the same thing. I don't think that matters now, and I think almost like as this idea of this creating something, this kind of art that you'll consume, this pre-made cult classic they were trying to do, kind of, there's something about it that works in terms of that plot and in terms of what that film's about and what it's saying. It almost becomes perfect. That film was overlooked and ignored, and still today it doesn't have that kind of following that Rocky Horror has. It's not as queer, there's a kind of queerness to it, but it's not queer in the way that Rocky Horror is. It doesn't have the genre elements in the same way. But it's a real hoot. So I thoroughly recommend. Arrow Video did a really beautiful Blu-ray release of it a few years ago. Oh my god,
I definitely need to check it out. My final question for you then, it's a impossible question to answer in a way, but like, what do you think you talked about how in some ways this is the example of your ultimate kind of cult movie. Why do you think this movie, of all kind of 70s weird midnight cult movies, became this thing that it became? What is the secret behind the success of Rocky Horror, do you think?
Just because there's nothing else like it. Like, that's all it is. Like, there's literally nothing else like it. So it's like all these people that needed to see some version of themselves on screen, but some insane version of themselves on screen that they didn't even imagine existed. There wasn't another film that you could find. It's like this. It was like that thing of, discovery with this film, and it's like I said, it's like word of mouth. It's like, oh, you have to see this, you have to see this, and this idea of you weren't inundated with this imagery. It wasn't
so
something. So it connected with audiences. It connected with people in a way that it could only ever achieve that kind of status. It's like I said, it's a shoddy old piece of work, in lots of ways. It's never going to be a film that is going to be like critically adored, although of course over time its reputation completely changes. But that wasn't what it's for. It wasn't for critics. It was for fans. It was for audiences. And they found it, and they made it what it is.
Yeah, it's so true. And I suppose even just as a musical, there was nothing else like it. Almost still isn't really as well. But when you think about the kind of big sort of Oscar-winning musical films that came before this, like Oliver and Sound of Music and My Fair Lady and stuff as well, it's like even just in that genre, there's never been anything kind of as fun and daring as that, at least at the time, had there, I think.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. And it's kind of interesting to think about how daring and transgressive it was at the time, and how normal it is now, like how that film is so, it's like a family favorite now. Like, there was an episode of Glee that was like based around the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's fully afternoon stuff, and and that's exciting to me, still, and not disregarding all the things that I've said that I do think are really problematic about that film, but there is a celebration of queerness in that film that is exciting. I feel excited about new audiences finding that. I feel excited at the same time that there's a dialogue going on about what other things are going on in that film that you can have in tandem. It's like something doesn't negate another thing. So these conversations can happen together. Rocky Horror will always represent something to me that I will never forget and I would never want to ignore. I want to have the conversation about what's wrong with it. I want to have a conversation with new people that discover that film for the first time about what it meant to me. What does it mean to you now watching it? What does it mean to you now when there's so much queer imagery out there? You can go pop on Netflix and you can watch a million exciting, transgressive things. Does Rocky Horror still have that power to amaze and to astound and
so
to shock and to, in the same way that it once had? So I think that, I want to, make sure that kind of almost as I'm talking about this and talking about the film, that I'm not down on it. Yeah. I think that there's a really interesting conversation to be had and a really nuanced conversation to be had about what it means to audiences today, and that it should be still part of this kind of queer cultural dialogue. We just need to be thoughtful about the way that we talk about it.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's been fascinating to hear you talk about, actually, because it's so true. And I think all of those things, like you said, all of these things can be, true at the same time, can't they? And we can celebrate parts of it and we can point out parts of it that maybe have dated.
Do you think this was like the most un-horror-y episode of the podcast ever? I feel like we didn't really talk about horror that much.
We didn't, did we? I mean,
I love horror films.
We love horror films. It's fine. It's fine. It's been nice to talk about something, slightly different, I suppose. And, I think it is, and we did talk about how much it is infused with that love for the genre and movies like The Old Dark House and everything. And I love, and that was certainly what drew me to it initially, I think, as sort of a teenage horror fan, that it, even though it wasn't horror, it still had that kind of iconography all over it.
I loved what you said at the beginning as well, when you were like, it had the word horror in the title.
Yeah, it had the word horror in the title. There's something kind of like sexy and kind of taboo about it.
All I need to know.
Yeah, exactly. It's all you need to know to want to see it. So there you go. Amazing. Well, Michael, thank you so much. It's been such a joy as ever. And just tell us, is there anything that you've got coming up, screenings or anything, any festival news or anything like that you want to plug?
Yeah, just working towards the London Film Festival at the moment. That's happening, fingers crossed, in October. So as part of that, I program the Cult Strand, so that's where we show all the kind of genre work, so keep an eye out for that. We'll be announcing the program for that in early September. And there's a monthly TerrorVision strand at BFI that I program, so a little surprise horror film every month. So again, just go on the BFI website, check out what's coming. There's a couple of nice juicy classics coming up soon.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my two brilliant guests, Neil Brand and Michael Blyth. I loved talking about this movie this week. Such a joy. It was a nice little change of pace from the usual horror stuff. I loved it. Did you guys enjoy that as much as me? I would love to hear your feedback. Please get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, and that can be found on Facebook. That discussion group is filled with some of the most lovely people that I've met in person through that discussion group, people who I've befriended, people who have ended up on the podcast because of their involvement in the discussion group. And there's even little sort of spin-offs now. There's like arms of the discussion group. I believe that a bunch of people based in the Midlands have actually created a group of Evolution of Horror Midlands listeners, and they're all organising a meetup. They're going to go to a 24-hour all-nighter horror marathon, I think in Birmingham. So, if you're in the Midlands area, then join up to that group as well, and then you can meet fellow EOH listeners and fellow horror fans. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to sign up to support this podcast and get treated to regular bonus episodes, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. If you want to pick up an EOH t-shirt or hoodie, then head on over to our merch shop. That's evolutionofhorror.com/shop. You can find all previous seasons and episodes of this podcast on our website, evolutionofhorror.com. You can find this podcast on all the usual podcast places. And if you get a minute, please drop us a little rating or review, preferably a nice positive one, please, on Apple Podcasts. That will really help us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, onwards to next week then, and we're going back to some more traditional horror. In fact, next week we're going to be discussing quite a popular, quite a beloved horror property, a franchise that consists of 5 movies that's just... It feels like it's just sort of quietly been going on in the background for the last 40 years. Next week, I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod, Steph McKenna, and we're going to be discussing that crazy, surreal, dreamlike sci-fi horror movie from 1979, Phantasm. Then, in the second half of the discussion, we will be speaking briefly about the sequels, Phantasm 2, 3, 4, and 5. However, the only spoilerific discussion will be the first Phantasm. So if you get a chance, check out Phantasm from 1979 before next week's discussion. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.